Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Today we have a great story, so let's get started right now.
Usually, when we talk about medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of total precision.
Right. It's very much like engineering.
Yeah, exactly. Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is.
It gives you this immediate sense of control, You have this visible, tangible problem, a clear category for it, and, an established protocol for fixing it.
But then you step into the world of internal biology, specifically things like neurodevelopment, trauma, and just our daily psychological environment. And suddenly, that x-ray machine is completely useless.
Oh, absolutely useless. The diagnostic landscape there is entirely murky.
And nowhere is that more true than with a word that you, the listener, probably use every single day. A word you honestly probably use on your way to work this morning. Stress.
It's unavoidable in our modern vocabulary.
Right. So today, the mission for this deep dive is to completely break down the actual measurable biology of stress. We're going to separate the everyday colloquial complaints from the hardcore clinical realities.
Which is so needed right now.
By the end of this, you're going to have the tools to understand exactly what is happening inside your body when the pressure's on. So, okay, let's unpack this. We use the word stress for literally everything, don't we?
We really do. It's become this bizarre catch-all.
Yeah, like you're stuck in traffic or your train is delayed and you say, I'm so stressed. But then someone experiences a severe psychiatric crisis like post-traumatic stress disorder, or a soldier returns from combat, and we use the exact same word.
I mean, we throw it around to describe everything from a minor annoyance like spilling coffee to severe clinical trauma.
Because we use it for everything, the word has just completely lost its diagnostic utility in everyday conversation. We've watered it down to meaninglessness.
It's true. Our cultural understanding of this biological process has become incredibly imprecise, and that actually hinders our ability to treat it. But in a research context, stress has a highly specific, mathematically trackable meaning.
And getting to that meaning is actually, it's a pretty funny story, right?
It is. To see how we arrived at that definition, we actually have to look at a rather comical series of laboratory mistakes back in 1936.
You're talking about Hans Selye.
Exactly. Hans Selye, he was this Hungarian-Canadian endocrinologist working at McGill University. And the funny thing is, he wasn't actually trying to study stress at all.
What was he looking for?
He was trying to discover a new sex hormone. He was injecting laboratory rats with these various ovarian extracts, basically just to see what biological changes would happen in their bodies.
And from what I read, Selye was notoriously clumsy. Like a brilliant guy, but terrible in the lab.
He was a brilliant scientist, yes, but apparently a terrible animal handler. I mean, he would try to inject the rats, but he'd end up dropping them.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and then he'd have to chase them around the laboratory with a broom just to get them back in their cages.
Which, if you're a rat, is a terrifying experience.
Completely. You've got this giant predator chasing you with a broom every single morning. He was constant in dropping them, startling them, just roughly handling them day after day.
So what happened?
Well, after a few months of this, Selye examined the rats, and he found they all had the exact same 3 biological changes.
Okay, what were they?
They had severely enlarged adrenal glands, they had bleeding ulcers in their stomachs, and their immune tissues, specifically the thymus and spleen, had massively shrunken.
Wow. And then so at first, Selye must have thought, I've done it. I've discovered the effects of this new ovarian hormone.
He was thrilled. But then, he ran the control group.
Ah, the control group. Science ruins everything.
Right. He injected a separate group of rats with just plain saline solution, just salt water, no hormones at all.
Yeah.
But because he was still the one handling them.
He was still dropping them and chasing them with the broom.
Exactly. He was still terrifying them. And when he examined the control group, they had the exact same enlarged adrenal glands, the same stomach ulcers, and the same shrunken immune tissues.
That had to be a crushing moment for him initially. He realizes, wait, it isn't the chemical extract causing the biological changes at all. It's him.
It's the experience of being terrorized by a clumsy scientist. But, it turned into this paradigm-shifting realization. He decided to test this further.
How so?
He put rats in freezing temperatures. He put them on the roof of the building in the hot sun. He forced them to exercise incessantly. He even introduced mild toxins.
Just really putting these guys through the ringer.
He did. But what's fascinating here is that no matter what the specific negative input was, the biological output was identical. The enlarged adrenals, the ulcers, the shrunken immune system.
Which led to his monumental 1936 paper, right?
Yes, where he defined stress as the non-specific response of the body to any demand placed upon it.
That phrase, non-specific response, that is the absolute key to this whole puzzle. He realized that the human body, well, the mammalian body in general, responds to incredibly diverse challenges through one common physiological pathway.
He called it the General Adaptation Syndrome, or the GAS.
The GAS. I always think of Sallee's General Adaptation Syndrome like a car engine revving.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, because whether you are joyriding on a beautiful racetrack on a Sunday afternoon, or you are fleeing from a pursuer in a high-speed chase, the internal combustion engine under the hood is doing the exact same thing to generate power.
Right, it doesn't know the context.
Exactly. It's pulling in oxygen, combusting fuel, and spinning the pistons. The engine just knows it has received a signal to produce power immediately.
And Sallee basically mapped out how that engine operates over time into 3 distinct phases.
Walk us through those.
First is the alarm reaction. The threat is detected, and the body initiates the emergency response.
The engine turns on.
Right. Second is the resistance phase, where the body mobilizes all its metabolic resources to meet the ongoing demand. This is the engine running at high RPMs.
Okay, and the third?
Finally, the exhaustion phase. Now, this only occurs if the demand persists so long that the body simply runs out of resources to keep up that resistance. The engine essentially overheats and breaks down.
Because it operates like a mechanical system, this means stress isn't just this vague, cloudy feeling floating around in your consciousness.
No, not at all.
It has known biological components. It has known consequences that we can actually measure in a lab, we can manipulate them, and we can intervene.
Which takes it completely out of the realm of abstract psychology and places it firmly in the realm of hard physical biology. What Sallee proved is that your body fundamentally does not know the difference between a freezing cold temperature and a threatening email from your boss.
That is wild to think about.
The physiological alarm bells that start ringing are completely identical.
So if our bodies use the exact same internal machinery for every single type of threat, what exactly is happening under the hood when that alarm sounds? Like, we all know the feeling of panic, but what is the actual biological cascade?
Well, the stress response originally evolved as an emergency mobilization system for physical threats. Think of Walter Cannon, another pioneer who coined the term fight or flight back in 1932.
Right, fight or flight.
This entire response starts in the brain's threat detection center. Primarily, it's a small almond-shaped structure deep in the brain called the amygdala.
The amygdala is basically the biological smoke detector.
A highly, highly sensitive smoke detector. When the amygdala spots a threat, say, a tiger stepping out of the brush or a car scurving into your lane on the highway, it instantly triggers 2 biological cascades simultaneously. We call them the fast pathway and the slow pathway.
Let's trace the fast one first.
Yeah.
This is the sympathetic nervous system. And when we say fast, we mean literal milliseconds.
Oh, it acts like a lightning strike. The sympathetic nervous system sends electrical signals right down your spinal cord that tell your adrenal glands to dump adrenaline, which is also known as epinephrine and noradrenaline, directly into your bloodstream.
And the effects are just immediate.
Immediate, systemic, and designed for violent physical action.
This is where you literally feel your body changing in real time. Your heart rate violently spikes. Your blood pressure shoots up. And one of the most fascinating mechanisms here is where the blood actually goes.
Yes, the vascular constriction.
Blood is rapidly redirected away from your digestive organs and your skin, and the body pushes it straight into your large muscle groups in your legs and arms.
Which perfectly explains several common physical sensations associated with panic. I mean, when blood rushes away from your stomach, you experience that fluttering, that butterflies in your stomach feeling, or even nausea.
Right. And when blood drains from your skin, your face goes pale and your skin gets cold and clammy.
Your body is making a ruthless evolutionary calculation. Digesting that sandwich you just ate is not a priority right now, and if a predator claws your skin, having less surface blood flow means you won't bleed out as quickly. All resources are diverted to the muscles you need to sprint or fight.
That's incredible. And at the exact same time, your liver gets the signal to release a massive dose of stored glucose into the bloodstream, right? For instant cellular energy.
Yes. Your pupils dilate to let in more light, expanding your peripheral vision so you can see threats better. Your breathing deepens and accelerates to pull in more oxygen. It really is a masterpiece of instantaneous biological engineering.
That is a fast pathway.
Yeah.
Adrenaline. It gets you out of the way of the swerving car before you even consciously realize what you've done.
Exactly. But, as I mentioned, the amygdala triggered a second cascade at the exact same time. The slow pathway.
Okay, the slow pathway. This is governed by the HPA axis. We hear this term thrown around a lot in wellness spaces online, but let's actually break down what it means. It stands for the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
It's essentially a chemical chain of command. Think of the hypothalamus, which sits in your brain, as the CEO of the body's internal state.
Okay, the CEO.
When the amygdala sounds the alarm, the CEO hypothalamus releases a chemical messenger called CRH, or corticotropin-releasing hormone.
So the CEO sends a memo.
Exactly, a very urgent memo. That CRH memo travels a tiny distance to the pituitary gland, which hangs just below the brain. The pituitary is like the middle manager.
Makes sense.
It receives the CRH memo and responds by releasing its own messenger into the general bloodstream called ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone.
And this ACTH travels all the way down through your blood to the adrenal cortex,
Yeah.
which is the outer layer of the adrenal gland sitting right on top of your kidneys. The adrenal cortex is the factory floor.
Perfect analogy, yes.
And when it gets the ACTH order from the middle manager, it starts manufacturing and releasing the heavy hitter, cortisol.
Cortisol is the famous stress hormone. And because this HPA axis relies on hormones traveling through the bloodstream rather than electrical signals traveling down nerves like the fast pathway, it takes longer. Cortisol reaches its peak concentration in the blood about 15 to 20 minutes after the stressful event starts.
So while adrenaline gives you the initial explosive energy to sprint away from the tiger, cortisol is there to maintain that elevated state of arousal, if you need to keep running for the next hour.
Exactly. It mobilizes long-term energy reserves. It pulls from stored fat and protein and converts them into usable glucose.
But it also does something fascinating in the brain, doesn't it?
It does. Cortisol physically consolidates stress-relevant memories in the hippocampus.
Why does it do that?
Well, it makes perfect evolutionary sense. If you survive a tiger attack near a specific watering hole, your brain wants a highly detailed, deeply ingrained memory of exactly what that watering hole looked like, smelled like, and sounded like, so you never ever go near it again.
Yeah.
Cortisol acts like chemical glue for traumatic memories.
Wow. But cortisol also does something else that feels, at least to me, deeply counterintuitive. Cortisol actively suppresses the immune system.
It does.
And I have to push back on this biology a bit, because if cortisol is shutting down our immune function, halting our tissue repair, and drastically altering our metabolism by breaking down fat and muscle protein, isn't the body technically poisoning us to save us?
It's a stark way to look at it, but yes.
It's like borrowing money from a loan shark at a 500% interest rate to pay a kidnapper. Like, it's fantastic for immediate survival. You don't die today, but it's a terrible long-term wealth strategy. You are literally destroying your future to survive the present.
That is exactly what is happening. And eventually, the biological loan sharks come to collect. That collection process is where the real damage happens, which we'll get into. But in the short term, the logic is flawless.
How so?
Think about it. If you are running from a predator, you do not need your immune system wasting precious metabolic energy fighting off a mild cold. You don't need to be building bone density, and you certainly don't need to be ovulating or producing reproductive hormones.
Right. All of that is relevant if you're dead in 5 minutes.
Exactly. All of those long-term building projects are immediately shut down, so 100% of your energy can be routed to your thighs and your lungs.
Okay, that makes sense. So how does the body know when it's safe to start building bone density again? How does it know when to stop borrowing at that 500% interest rate?
In a healthy, well-regulated system, there is a crucial negative feedback loop.
Okay.
Once cortisol levels get high enough in the bloodstream, that cortisol eventually circulates back up to the brain. It hits the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and it essentially tells them, message received, we have enough cortisol down here.
Like a thermostat turning off the heat when the room is warm enough.
Precisely. The hypothalamus then stops producing CRH, the pituitary stops producing ACTH, and the system effectively turns its own engine off, bringing the body back down to a resting baseline.
But that off switch can break. When researchers talk about the dysregulation of the HPA axis, there are two main ways it goes wrong, right?
Wow.
HPA axis sensitization and HPA axis exhaustion.
Yes. Let's start with sensitization. With HPA axis sensitization, the negative feedback loop becomes faulty and the system becomes hyperreactive.
What does that look like?
You get an exaggerated, massive cortisol spike to even the most modest, tiny stressors. The system is just too sensitive. You drop your keys, and your body mounts a chemical response appropriate for a car crash.
Oh man, that sounds exhausting.
Yeah.
And on the other end of the spectrum is HPA axis exhaustion.
Right. In exhaustion, the system has been run so hard for so long that the adrenal factory essentially goes on strike.
It just quits.
It quits. You get a flattened cortisol response, a genuine threat appears, but the body completely fails to mobilize adequate energy. You feel profoundly lethargic, unmotivated, and physically incapable of rising to the occasion.
And both of these dysregulations are highly measurable in saliva and blood tests, right?
Very measurable. And they lead to very specific, severe pathological outcomes.
Since the body reacts so violently to these demands,
Yes.
and we can clearly see the biological cost of these hormones flooding our system and shutting down our immune systems, it seems logical to assume all stress is inherently bad.
It's a very common assumption.
Right. It feels like the ultimate goal of life should just be to sit on a beach and avoid stress at all costs. But that leads to one of the biggest misconceptions in modern psychology, doesn't it?
It's a massive misconception. And it completely ignores a critical distinction that Selye himself made all the way back in the beginning. The distinction between distress, which is what we typically think of, the damaging kind of stress, and eustress.
Eustress, spelled Eustress. Good stress.
Good stress. Eustress is the form of stress associated with challenges that are highly demanding, yes, but they are manageable. They produce growth.
Like what?
Like learning a new language, training for a marathon, or taking on a complex project at work that you are genuinely passionate about. When you are experiencing eustress, you feel engaged, invigorated, and motivated.
And distress.
Distress happens when the demands clearly exceed your coping resources. It produces damage rather than growth, and it feels deeply threatening and overwhelming.
And this brings in a psychologist named Richard Lazarus. In the 1960s, Lazarus developed the cognitive appraisal theory of stress, which basically fundamentally changed how we view this entire process.
It was revolutionary.
He figured out that the biological stress response, that whole cascade of adrenaline and cortisol we just talked about, isn't actually determined by the objective reality of the stressor itself. It's determined by how you, internally, appraise your ability to cope with it.
This was a profound shift in how we understand human biology. Let's take an objective event. Say, a high-stakes presentation to a board of directors, or stepping onto a court for a competitive athletic performance.
No.
For one person, that exact same event produces eustress. They appraise the situation and unconsciously determine, I have the skills for this. This is an opportunity to shine.
So what happens biologically?
Their body still releases adrenaline, their heart rate still goes up, but their blood vessels actually dilate to increase blood flow, and they feel pumped up and hyper-focused.
But for another person, it produces debilitating distress.
Precisely. The second person appraises the exact same room, the same stakes, and the same audience, and determines, I don't have what it takes. This is a threat to my survival and my status.
And their biology reflects that.
Yes. Their blood vessels constrict, their cortisol spikes aggressively, and they experience cognitive impairment and panic. The objective reality of the room is identical. The biological difference is purely based on their internal appraisal of their own resources.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because of Lazarus's work, we know that this appraisal isn't entirely unconscious. You can literally hack your own biological response.
You can.
If you consciously reframe a threat as a challenge, you can actually shift your physiological experience from distress to eustress in real time.
You're effectively using your highly evolved prefrontal cortex, the logical reasoning part of your brain, to send a message down to the primitive amygdala. You are telling the amygdala a different story about the environment.
Right, like talking yourself off a ledge.
Exactly. When you tell yourself, my heart is beating fast right now because my body is giving me the energy I need to crush this presentation, the amygdala actually stands down the distress cascade and shifts into the eustress cascade.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it completely changes the paradigm of how we approach our lives. For many people, in many contexts, stress reduction is actually the wrong goal. Trying to achieve zero stress is a mistake that just leads to stagnation. The true goal is optimal stress.
Which brings us to the Yerkes-Dodson law. It's a psychological principle established over a century ago. It graphs the relationship between arousal and performance as an upside-down U-curve.
Walk us through the curve.
If you have a very low level of challenge in your life, you are on the far left of the curve. You aren't peaceful, you are bored, disengaged, lethargic, and your performance is terrible.
Right. And if you have a very high level of challenge, you are on the far right of the curve. You experience anxiety, impairment, and burnout.
But right in the middle, at the peak of that inverted U, that moderate challenge, that is where you find peak performance and flow. It's all about riding the edge of what is manageable.
So cognitive reframing is incredibly powerful for those acute moments, like a presentation or a sprint, to keep us in that eustress zone. But what happens when the demands simply don't stop? What happens when you can't just reframe your way out of a toxic work environment, or chronic financial instability, or a really prolonged caregiving situation? And that distress is just left running in the background for months or even years.
That is when we enter the territory of chronic stress. And the health consequences of a chronically activated HPA axis and sympathetic nervous system are just devastating.
How bad are we talking?
We are talking about some of the most extensively documented relationships in all of modern epidemiology.
Let's break down the physical toll system by system, just so we can see exactly what the biological loan sharks are taking from us, starting with the cardiovascular system.
Chronic cortisol elevation is brutal on the heart and blood vessels. When your sympathetic nervous system is constantly firing, it continuously spikes your blood pressure, and this creates mechanical stress on your arterial walls.
Like pushing too much water through a pipe.
Exactly. And this mechanical stress causes microscopic tearing, which promotes atherogenesis, which is the formation of arterial plaques. Your body tries to heal the tiny tears with cholesterol, and that literally clogs your arteries over time.
And it changes the blood itself, doesn't it?
Yes. Chronic stress actually increases your blood viscosity. It makes your blood thicker and stickier.
Why would it do that?
From an evolutionary standpoint, it makes total sense. If you are about to be bitten by a tiger, you want your blood to clot quickly so you don't bleed to death.
Oh, wow.
But when that happens chronically while you're just sitting at a desk, that thick blood is incredibly hard to pump, and it drastically increases the risk of a clot forming and causing a heart attack or a stroke.
You know, it reminds me of the famous Whitehall studies. These were led by Sir Michael Marmot starting in the late 1960s, and they looked at thousands of British civil servants.
A classic study.
Yeah, and the British civil service is highly stratified. There is a very clear hierarchy of job grades, from messengers and clerks at the bottom, all the way up to senior administrators at the top.
It was the perfect natural experiment for studying chronic stress. Because all these workers had the exact same access to socialized healthcare, they lived in similar regions, and they worked in the same buildings.
But what Marmot and his team found was shocking. They found that employment grade, which served as a proxy for how much control someone had over their work, and consequently, how much chronic psychosocial stress they endured, perfectly predicted cardiovascular mortality.
It was a continuous, undeniable gradient. The lower you were on the hierarchy, the less control you had, the more chronic stress you endured, and the more likely you were to die of heart disease.
And this gradient held completely independent of normal risk factors, right?
Completely independent. Even when they controlled for diet, smoking, and exercise, the men at the bottom of the hierarchy had roughly 3 times the mortality rate of the men at the top. The data basically proved that chronic psychosocial stress kills people through their hearts.
And it doesn't stop at the heart. Let's talk about immune dysregulation. Because earlier you explained that in an acute emergency, cortisol logically suppresses the immune system so you can prioritize physical escape.
Right.
But chronic stress causes this paradoxical twofold damage to our immunity that seems entirely contradictory until you look at the mechanisms.
It is a deeply complex failure of the system. On one hand, chronic stress causes severe, persistent immunosuppression. It massively reduces your natural killer cells, which are the immune cells responsible for destroying tumors and virally infected cells.
So you get sick more often.
Yes, it impairs your wound healing, and it makes you highly susceptible to standard viral infections like the common cold.
But simultaneously, it causes immune overactivation in other areas. It elevates inflammatory cytokines.
Right. Think of cytokines as chemical text messages that immune cells send to each other to coordinate an attack.
Okay.
When cortisol is chronically high for months or years, the immune cells eventually become deaf to it. They develop what we call glucocorticoid resistance.
So they just stop listening to the boss.
Because they stop listening to the anti-inflammatory signals of cortisol, the immune system just goes rogue. It starts flooding the body with these inflammatory text messages, essentially calling in airstrikes on your own healthy tissue.
So it's suppressing the parts of the immune system that actually fight off viruses, but hyperactivating the inflammatory parts that end up attacking your own body, leading to autoimmune issues, joint pain, and even driving the neuroinflammation that contributes to severe depression.
Exactly. The connection between chronic stress and systemic aging through this runaway inflammation is direct, and it's mechanistically well understood.
But I think the neurological effects are what really scare people the most.
Yeah.
What is high cortisol physically doing to the architecture of the brain?
High sustained levels of cortisol are literally neurotoxic to the hippocampus. As we mentioned earlier, the hippocampus is the brain structure absolutely central to memory formation, contextual learning, and emotional regulation. Chronic cortisol exposure causes the dendrites, the branching connections between neurons in the hippocampus, to wither and retract. Over time, it literally reduces the physical volume of the structure. It shrinks it.
Wait, really? So when people complain about brain fog during a stressful year, or they say they just can't remember simple things, that isn't just them being distracted.
No, it is the result of physical, structural compromise to the brain. Your hardware is being degraded. And in severe cases, this hippocampal atrophy is a primary feature of what we see in major depression and PTSD.
That's terrifying.
Furthermore, chronic stress compromises the prefrontal cortex. That's the advanced evolutionary part of the brain responsible for rational decision-making, impulse control, empathy, and emotional regulation.
Which explains so much about human behavior. When you are going through a terrible, stressful period at work or going through a divorce and you find yourself snapping at your kids or crying over a dropped spoon or making terrible, impulsive financial decisions, that isn't a moral failing or a psychological weakness.
Not at all.
Your prefrontal cortex is literally being chemically hobbled by your adrenal glands.
The higher order reasoning center is physically compromised, which allows the primitive emotional centers of the brain to completely drive your behavior.
So what does this all mean? When someone talks about having a broken heart from the stress of a terrible job or a toxic relationship, does this mean they literally have a plaque-filled, inflamed heart and a physically shrunken memory center?
In a prolonged chronic scenario, yes. The metaphorical damage we talk about in poetry and literature is mirroring literal biological damage. The wear and tear is systemic.
Because chronic stress attacks the heart, the immune system, and the brain simultaneously, scientists realized they needed a new way to measure this total system-wide cost. It wasn't enough to just look at a patient's blood pressure or just look at their white blood cell count. They needed a metric for the total damage.
And that need brought us to the highly elegant concept of allostatic load.
This framework was introduced by researchers Bruce McEwen and Elliot Steller in 1993. Let's unpack the terms here. First, there's allostasis. What is the difference between allostasis and the concept we all learned in high school biology? Homeostasis.
Well, homeostasis is the idea that the body has strict, unchangeable set points, like a body temperature of 98.6 degrees, and it always strives to return exactly to that point.
Right.
Allostasis is a much more dynamic concept. It translates to maintaining stability through change. It recognizes that your body alters its physiological set points in response to environmental demands. Your body adapts. It's the active process of keeping you balanced in a constantly changing world.
Okay, so allostasis is the active, healthy balancing act. Then what is allostatic load?
Allostatic load is the cumulative biological wear and tear that happens when that adaptive process runs chronically rather than just temporarily. It is the accumulated cost of constantly having to readjust your physiological set points to deal with relentless stress.
McEwen's framework is brilliant because it details 4 distinct patterns of allostatic load, 4 different ways this wear and tear manifests in humans. Instead of just listing them out, let's imagine a hypothetical worker. Let's call him David.
Okay, David.
David is working as a mid-level manager in a highly toxic corporate environment. The first pattern is frequent stress with insufficient recovery.
Right. So for David, this looks like getting hammered with 50 urgent, high-stakes emails a day, back-to-back meetings where his competence is constantly questioned, and impossible deadlines.
Just nonstop.
His body mounts a full fight-or-flight response 20 times a day, and he never gets a chance to recover. His HPA axis is constantly firing.
The second pattern of allostatic load is the inability to shut off the stress response after the threat is gone.
So David goes home at 6 p.m., the office is closed, the immediate threat is physically gone. But because of the toxic environment, his biological off switch is broken.
He's still carrying it.
He sits on his couch, physically safe, but he is ruminating on what his boss said. And he's checking his phone under the dinner table. His cortisol remains elevated long into the evening, disrupting his sleep architecture and preventing tissue repair.
The third pattern is inadequate activation. This is the exhausted HPA axis we talked about earlier. Let's say 5 years go by for David in this awful job.
After 5 years of patterns 1 and 2, David's adrenal system simply gives up. Now, when a major presentation comes up, a situation where he actually needs that cortisol spike to perform well, his body fails to mount the necessary response.
He just can't get it together.
He experiences profound fatigue, he can't get out of bed, and he just can't mobilize the energy to meet the demand.
And the fourth pattern is inadequate compensatory responses. This is when one system fails to do its job, forcing another system to overreact and compensate.
Because David's cortisol levels have flatlined, the anti-inflammatory signal in his body is completely gone. To compensate, his inflammatory immune pathways go completely rogue. He starts developing rheumatoid arthritis, systemic joint pain, and severe metabolic syndrome.
This framework completely solves a massive medical mystery for me. You look at a deeply stressful corporate environment or an intense hospital ward, you have 4 employees sitting in the exact same environment, dealing with the exact same terrible boss and the exact same chronic stress.
Right.
And yet one person has a heart attack. The second person develops severe clinical depression. The third person triggers an autoimmune disorder. And the fourth person starts experiencing severe cognitive decline. Under Salih's original model, you might wonder why the outcomes are so drastically different. But allostatic load explains it perfectly.
It illuminates the reality that the stress response is a systemic cascade, and it will break whatever system is most vulnerable. It all depends on which biological system in that specific individual bears the most load, based on their unique history, their genetics, and their existing biological weak points.
But this makes me wonder, if allostatic load is highly individualized and it builds up over years, is it possible we're all walking around accumulating invisible biological debt in different organs without even realizing it until the system completely bankrupts?
It's more than possible. It is the absolute reality for a massive portion of the modern workforce. Unless you are actively monitoring your health and aggressively prioritizing recovery, that wear and tear is accumulating silently in your arteries, your hippocampus, and your immune cells.
And when that biological bankruptcy happens specifically in the context of our modern workplace, it takes on a very specific clinical form, a word we hear all the time but rarely truly understand. Burnout.
Burnout is a fascinating and deeply misunderstood phenomenon. It is not just being tired.
Where did the term even come from?
It was first described in the scientific literature by a psychologist named Herbert Freudenberger in 1974. He was observing the staff at a free clinic for drug addicts in New York. The staff were working insane hours for no pay, and they were fundamentally breaking down.
But it was really popularized later, right?
Yes, burnout was really operationalized and brought into the clinical spotlight by Christina Maslach at UC Berkeley.
She created the Maslach Burnout Inventory, which is still the gold standard research instrument used all over the world today.
Maslach interviewed thousands of human services workers, nurses, social workers, teachers, and she identified 3 distinct necessary components of true clinical burnout. You have to have all of these to differentiate it from ordinary fatigue. The first is emotional exhaustion.
What does that actually look like in practice?
It is a profound paralytic depletion of emotional resources. It makes any further engagement with your work feel physically and psychologically impossible. It's the feeling of waking up, thinking about your inbox, and feeling like you were trying to lift a 1,000-pound boulder.
The second component Maslach identified is depersonalization, or cynicism. And this was the one that really damages workplace cultures.
This is a defense mechanism.
Right.
Because the worker is so emotionally exhausted, they develop a detached, callous, or highly cynical attitude toward their work, their clients, or their colleagues.
So they just stop caring.
A burned-out nurse stops seeing patients as human beings in pain and starts seeing them as annoying burdens or just a room number. A teacher stops caring about the student's success and views them as adversaries. You literally stop seeing people as people.
Wow. And the third component is a reduced sense of personal accomplishment.
The overwhelming, pervasive feeling that nothing you do matters, your efforts are completely ineffective, and your work has lost all meaning or value.
Now, people often confuse burnout with depression, and they share overlapping symptoms, but the distinction is clinically very important. Burnout is specifically tied to the context of work.
That's a key distinction.
The symptoms usually appear in the workplace, and the person might actually function okay in other domains of their life. They can still enjoy their weekend hobbies. Depression, on the other hand, is pervasive. It blankets everything.
That's a crucial distinction for treatment. Another key difference is the history of the individual. Burnout almost always stems from a history of excessive engagement.
So it's not laziness.
Not at all. It is an affliction of the highly dedicated. It happens to people who cared very deeply about their work, who invested massive amounts of energy, empathy, and passion, and who were eventually biologically and emotionally depleted by that heavy investment without adequate structural support. You can develop depression without any prior history of heavy investment or passion.
Although, to be fair, the data shows that severe burnout highly predicts subsequent depression if left untreated. But they are distinct entities. In fact, the distinction is so strong that in 2019, the World Health Organization officially added burnout to the International Classification of Diseases.
They did.
They didn't classify it as a medical condition, but specifically as an occupational phenomenon resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed.
Which was a massive vindication for researchers who had been fighting to get this recognized for decades. But it also came with a significant downside. The cultural mainstreaming of the word burnout has diluted its clinical severity.
We're back to the exact same problem we have with the word stress. Now, someone has a mildly long week, they feel a bit unmotivated on a Friday afternoon, and they sigh and say, "Oh, I'm so burnt out."
Using burnout as a synonym for ordinary fatigue or a temporary lack of motivation complicates everything. It makes epidemiological research much harder, and it makes treatment planning far more complicated because the true devastating severity of clinical exhaustion is being masked by casual, everyday use.
I look at true clinical burnout like a smartphone battery. Depression might be like a battery that just has a manufacturing defect and won't hold a charge anymore, regardless of how you use it. But burnout is a battery that was plugged into the wrong hypercharged voltage for so long, running 60 intensive background apps simultaneously for months, that the internal chemistry of the battery fundamentally melted.
That is an incredibly apt analogy.
It only happened because you were trying to do so much, care so much, and power too many things at once.
Because the internal chemistry has been fundamentally altered by the excessive demand. You cannot fix a melted battery by just turning the phone off for the weekend.
Which brings us to the million-dollar question. If we understand the devastating mechanisms of allostatic load, and we see the biological melting point of clinical burnout, how do we stop the damage? What actually clears this biological debt?
Wow.
Because there's a massive multi-billion-dollar commercial stress management industry out there selling us a lot of bath bombs, supplements, and fancy retreats.
We need to be highly, highly critical of that industry. Much of the commercial stress management space relies heavily on placebo effects and lacks rigorous evidence. If we want to clear biological debt, we need to focus on interventions that have undeniable, measurable, peer-reviewed impacts on the HPA axis and the sympathetic nervous system.
And the single most robust intervention, the one with the most undeniable evidence across decades of research, is physical exercise.
It is the ultimate biological reset button. The mechanisms behind exercise are incredibly powerful. First, physical activity directly metabolizes the excess cortisol and adrenaline that is sitting in your bloodstream.
Just burns it up.
If your body prepared you to run from a tiger and you actually go for a run, you are completing the biological stress cycle. You are literally burning off the chemical stress response.
But wait, earlier you said cortisol is physically shrinking the hippocampus. How is exercise fixing that? Is it just burning off the cortisol, or is it actually rebuilding the tissue?
It is actively rebuilding the tissue. When you exercise, your brain produces a protein called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor.
BDNF.
Think of BDNF as high-grade fertilizer for your brain cells. It stimulates neurogenesis, it helps grow brain new neurons, and heals the structural dendritic damage in the hippocampus that chronic cortisol exposure caused. It is quite literally structural repair for your memory center.
Wait, so exercise literally secretes a chemical that acts like fertilizer for the stressed out brain, physically repairing the exact damage cortisol caused. That is incredible. But exercise also trains the system itself, right?
Yes. When you exercise, you acting as a controlled practice session for your HPA axis. You voluntarily spike your heart rate and your stress hormones, and then when you stop, your body practices returning to baseline. It trains your biological off switch to function properly, preventing that allostatic load accumulation.
The second proven intervention is MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction. And to be clear, this isn't just casual meditation or listening to a rain soundtrack on YouTube. This is a highly specific, standardized 8-week program developed by John Kabat-Zinn at the University of Massachusetts Medical School in the late 1970s.
MBSR has over 40 years of randomized controlled trial data behind it. And what it fundamentally does is build what we call non-reactive attentional capacity. Through intensive practice, you develop the ability to observe stressful thoughts and physical stress responses without automatic escalation.
Wait, let me push back on this on behalf of anyone currently dealing with a terrible job. If I'm doing MBSR, but my boss is still a tyrant, my environment hasn't changed, the threat is still there.
Yeah.
How does focusing on my breath or sitting quietly on a cushion actually change the cortisol in my blood if the objective threat is still right in front of me on Monday morning?
It goes right back to Richard Lazarus and cognitive appraisal. MBSR doesn't change the boss. It changes the amygdala's reaction to the boss.
Okay.
When your boss yells, your heart rate naturally spikes. Without mindfulness, your brain interprets that spiking heart rate as, I am in mortal danger, and it pours gasoline on the fire, triggering the HPA axis to dump cortisol. With mindfulness, you notice the heart rate spiking, you notice the panic thought, but you don't attach to it. You don't pour the gasoline.
You just watch it happen.
You change the internal narrative from mortal threat to passing physical sensation. And the data clearly shows this altered cognitive appraisal physically reduces cortisol reactivity in the blood.
So you are severing the link between the environmental trigger and the biological cascade.
Exactly. You are reclaiming control of your own internal engine. And the third intervention is perhaps the most fundamental to our species: social support.
The most consistent protective factor we have. But again, how does talking to a friend actually stop a biological hormone cascade?
Social support operates through multiple direct biological mechanisms. When you engage in positive social connection, your brain releases oxytocin.
The cuddle hormone.
Right. And oxytocin is effectively the anti-cortisol. It directly dampens the reactivity of the HPA axis and promotes parasympathetic nervous system activity, the rest and digest state. Furthermore, social support buffers your cognitive appraisal. A massive threat looks much more manageable when you know you aren't facing it alone. Your brain calculates that you have shared resources, which shifts the appraisal from distress to eustress.
This raises a critical point about modern society. The health research now is so unambiguous that the absence of social support, chronic loneliness, is treated as an independent health risk equivalent to smoking, isn't it?
According to a vast body of literature, chronic isolation carries a mortality risk equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It is more dangerous than obesity or physical inactivity.
So we have to ask ourselves, are increasingly isolated, remote, siloed work environments structurally denying us our most effective biological defense mechanism? If we were working alone in our apartments, staring at screens, disconnected from a physical community, we are stripping away our oxytocin buffer. We are facing the modern tiger completely alone.
This raises an important question. It is a profound structural vulnerability in how we currently live and work.
To utilize all these interventions effectively, to actually deploy exercise, mindfulness, and community to protect our health, we have to be able to accurately name what we are fighting. Which brings us to the language we use.
The English vocabulary around stress has exploded over the past 2 decades. We've taken concepts that used to be strictly confined to clinical psychology and brought them directly into mainstream professional communication.
Words like burnout, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, psychological safety, and emotional labor. They are everywhere now.
And while we discussed earlier how some of this can lead to colloquial dilution, the practical utility of these terms is immense. Distinguishing between eustress and distress, or being able to clearly articulate the difference between burnout and depression, allows for conceptual precision. It allows us to measure the problem.
Having the right vocabulary isn't just about sounding sophisticated in an HR meeting. It's a vital diagnostic tool. If you say, I'm stressed about this deadline, your boss or your doctor hears a temporary, normal reaction. They think you just need a cup of coffee.
Right, they dismiss it.
But if you have the vocabulary to say, I am experiencing chronic allostatic load that is affecting my physical health and pushing me toward clinical burnout, that commands an entirely different level of understanding and a completely different structural response.
It is the difference between asking for a glass of water and asking for a structural intervention. You have to be able to identify the severity of the biological process occurring within you to get the right help.
If you can't name the demon, you can't fight it. We've covered incredible ground today. We started with Hans Selye dropping rats and discovering the revving engine of the general adaptation syndrome.
the nonspecific response.
We trace the fast adrenaline lightning strike of the sympathetic nervous system and the slow cortisol burn of the HPA axis. We explored Richard Lazarus and the incredible power of cognitive appraisal to turn distress into eustress.
We looked at the systemic wreckage of allostatic load, understanding how chronic stress alters our cardiovascular system, our immune response, and the physical architecture of our brains. And we distinguished the distinct clinical reality of burnout from everyday fatigue.
And finally, we mapped out the biological cures, how exercise physically repairs the brain with BDNF, how mindfulness rebuilds our attentional capacity to sever the stress cascade, and how community and social support act as our ultimate biological shield through oxytocin.
You now possess the framework to properly appraise the demands in your own life. You can seek out optimal challenges, recognize when your internal engine is revving far too high without an off switch, and deploy the precise vocabulary needed to protect your health and the health of those around you.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your week.
Consider this. Our physical stress response is fundamentally a survival mechanism, perfectly evolved over millions of years to save us from acute life-or-death physical dangers. Yet our modern world primarily presents us with chronic psychological threats that never truly end.
We're surrounded by them.
Are we living in a time where our own evolutionary success, the absolute brilliance of the fight-or-flight system, is the very thing that is slowly killing us? And if Richard Lazarus was right that merely changing our cognitive appraisal can transform a toxic biological threat into a healthy biological challenge, what other fundamental physical realities can the human mind completely rewrite just by changing the narrative?
It makes you wonder, maybe that diagnostic landscape isn't just murky because we don't have the right X-ray machine. Maybe it's murky because, unlike a broken bone, the shape of our stress is something we are actively drawing ourselves, minute by minute, thought by thought.